on to episode number 3 of the Lifestyle Empowerment Podcast. So, on the last episode, I did mention I was going to be talking about a specific subject, but I decided to change my mind, and I'm going to talk about PCOS today, so Polycystic Ovarian Syndrome. And the reason being is because I continuously see posts being put out of what I personally feel may not be the most accurate information. Not only when it comes to addressing PCOS, but also diagnosing it, and then like some misinformation for sure. Not that this information is potentially harming anybody. I kind of would just like to give my insight, my education, my experience with polycystic ovarian syndrome. I haven't really created, if any, content around polycystic ovarian syndrome, which is interesting because I actually work with it quite a bit. It's some of the first things that I worked with coming up when I started this. So what is PCOS? Polycystic ovarian syndrome. Now, that's usually identified as numerous fluid-filled cysts found on the ovaries. And how they determine this is things like ultrasounds, or they get like potential indicators through blood work and whatnot. But a big statement here that is important to understand is not all PCOS has cysts, and having cysts does not always mean you have PCOS. And that one's really important to understand because a lot of people will go down these big rabbit holes trying to address this situation, not understanding that, so you'll have the PCOS symptoms, but you're not being diagnosed with PCOS. And that's because, you have no cysts. Well, I'll get into the forms and I'll explain how that is possible and help shed some light there, to hopefully, some people can find some better answers. With that being said, though, you could also have PCOS symptoms, but not have PCOS, which I will also get into. So polycystic ovarian syndrome, that can ultimately result in the ovaries producing more androgens. This is probably your most common form. And what androgens, think of them as just like receptors for testosterone. Think of them as muscle building, and we'll say, just for simplicity's sake, male characteristics. And what happens is most of the time this inhibits ovulation, which then it's like this vicious circle, and just makes things worse, just promotes, more hormonal imbalance, more androgen production, higher estrogen, decreased progesterone, all these cascade of things that come with this, right? And so when you look at, diagnosing this PCOS, how you can do that is, one, yes, you can use an ultrasound. You can see if there are cysts on the ovaries or cysts, period. And then that can help. Okay, now we know, maybe we should start looking into seeing if we actually have PCOS, not like saying because there's endometriosis or there's just having cysts that may not actually have the same effects as someone that's truly diagnosed with PCOS. There's also blood work, which that one's really important to understand how to read. A lot of people don't, mainly because, one, when you look at like ranges, all these ranges are saying, you might not get a disease. They're not actually indicating functional range. And you could have something that's like, this is optimal and this is optimal. It's near the lower end of the range, but it's still within the range. But that could mean something. Or it could be in the middle of the range. So the untrained eye would be like, sweet, it's in the middle, it must be good. When in reality, that could be telling a much bigger story. And so that's why it's important to understand how to diagnose blood work. Not that I would expect any general population person to understand how to do that. But same with doctors, right? Because their job is just to make sure you're within those ranges. It's not their job to make sure you're at a specific point within those ranges. Just as long as you're between the lines, that's all that matters. So anyways, Dutch testing is a really big way to test as well. That's a hormonal test. It's a urine test, dried urinalysis test for comprehensive hormones. That's what Dutch stands for. This will give you a good indicator of androgens because you can't really check androgens that well via blood work. You also can't check that well like your alpha reductase and stuff, which I won't get into all that stuff, but this is a good way. I do have my Dutch training. I'm a Dutch provider. This is a good way to discover, what form of PCOS do you have and to what degree do you have? Because like you'll read a lot of things like, I'll jump ahead quickly, like stinging nettle and saw palmetto, you're told to take to help with your PCOS symptoms. But if you don't have the high androgen form, it's not really necessary to take those. And if anything, it could make things worse, right? So it's important to understand what form you have to what degree to properly assess this and properly manage it. So what kind of happens too when you're talking about the high androgen form is you have your luteinizing hormone. And in terms of, we'll say in terms of the androgens, that luteinizing hormone is what promotes the production of androgens. And this is at, like, if you look, it's at a constant level. When on a normal menstrual cycle, it should be like low coming up to, and then when you come to the luteal phase, luteinizing hormone, it should increase, right? Because your corpus luteum is going to break down if you don't get pregnant from not receiving an egg. That is going to release progesterone, and that luteinizing hormone is going to stimulate a lot of things. But it's like this constant feed across the board, which is going to lead to the increased androgens. You're going to get a very low dip during that luteal phase compared to where it should be like this kind of thing. So the high androgen is probably one of the most common ones. And so, like, looking at symptoms here, I got on my list here, most commonly is the excessive unwanted body hair. So we're talking facial hair, anywhere on the body really. But also you could have balding. So that's a symptom there. Acne, mood swings, irritability, anger, frustration. Obviously, we all know irregular periods could be a symptom of PCOS. So low sex drive, they will label as a symptom of PCOS, that will be after having PCOS for a specific period of time. So after chronically having PCOS. Because initially you may have a very high sex drive because those higher androgens and that higher testosterone is going to increase the libido. But then over time, you'll notice your sex drive may drop off. And that's because the chronic exposure leads to the other conditions, inflammation and so on and so forth, which I'll get into, which will actually plummet that sex drive. Not to mention too, a lot of times like weight gain can occur with polycystic ovarian syndrome, and then that will result in lack of confidence and so on and so forth, poor sleep, everything, and then that will also decrease the sex drive. Obviously, seeing high testosterone on labs, insulin resistance. I will get into that because that's what everybody will say. Oh, it's just insulin resistance. Things like fatigue, and then obviously infertility. So those are some of your main symptoms that you could find when when addressing PCOS or diagnosing PCOS. So I'm going to talk about the forms. There are 4 major forms or 4 known forms, leading causers of PCOS. The first one would be the insulin resistance. And so now, what is insulin resistance? Essentially, when your body calls for an action, let's say there's a membrane, and you eat some carbohydrates, and the action is to secrete insulin because that's the storage hormone. It's what's going to drive the glucose into the muscle cell, fat cells, whichever, liver, so on and so forth. But think of it, the cell sometimes doesn't want to accept that insulin. So this is how my little analogy. Let's say you're hosting a house party and you live across the street from like a frat house or something, and one guy comes over from that frat house, this douchey frat guy, no offense, and he knocks on the door and he says, "Hey, can I come in? Can I come party with you guys?" And you're like, "No, like you're a douche. Get out of here." Right? So then you slam the door in his face, and he goes back and he grabs a bunch of his buddies from his frat house, and they all come in and they barge through your door. And they get in there, and these guys are known for wrecking things, so they start to cause a bunch of havoc. They, wreck things, stress you out, all sorts of these problems, right? That's what insulin resistance is. So when the cell is rejecting the insulin for whichever reason, the body's going to go, "No, you're going to take this insulin." So your pancreas releases more. And then eventually over time, you really, I'll say, muck up the cell membrane, and then it's not really accepting insulin, and you pump out so much. And this is why type 2 diabetes is very common amongst women with PCOS. And essentially the very basic way of explaining insulin resistance and why it occurs is inflammation. So one way you could look at it is, if a cell is under chronic inflammation, it doesn't want to bring in new nutrients. It's too busy breaking things down with its inflammatory signal. It's not ready for the anti-inflammatory to bring in the nutrients to rebuild. So it's rejecting that insulin because it's saying, "No, we're not ready." This is ultimately like how cells can die because they're not getting enough nutrients due to inflammation. because there's just that chronic inflammatory signal that's not being properly resolved and properly managed. So then you eventually just secrete so much insulin, the pancreas gets tired, the beta cells die off, and bam, that's how you can get type 2 diabetes, which is not just obesity and inflammation. It's also, not just obesity. It can be the inflammation from stress, because there are a handful of people that are not technically obese that have diabetes, not from genetics. So that insulin resistance, what happens though, those high levels of insulin is going to cause the ovaries to overproduce testosterone and androgens. And so this is your most common form. And that's why, essentially. So another form is post-pill. Now, this one can be very temporary, because if you come off the pill incorrectly, which many do, because there's very poor education out there on how to do so, plus doctors have absolutely no idea, you create this surge of hormones, specifically androgens, which then can create this PCOS symptoms. And now if it's not managed properly or addressed properly within a specific time frame, it ultimately can lead to long-term PCOS. So you definitely want to be careful coming off the pill. And then you can kind of lump the inflammation and insulin resistance together, because, as mentioned previously, the inflammation is going to create the insulin resistance. But that inflammation will also have an impact on hormones. It can cause your body to store androgens. Then you got to look like, where is that inflammation coming from? What a lot of people, so this is kind of something that sparked me wanting to make this podcast about PCOS, was gut health is a huge factor in this. But you have to look at, like, once again, gut health is the symptom. Like if you have an overgrowth of bacteria, if you have tight junction compromisation, whichever it may be, lack of stomach acid, lack of bowel, so on and so forth, these are symptoms. What created that? Now, I'm going to jump ahead here and say some of the most common causes, early causes of PCOS is trauma. Whether that be any form, childhood trauma, rape, just school, whatever, like any form of trauma, because that is stress, which could have led to downregulation in many things, upregulation of cortisol, nutrient depletion, destroying your guts, producing less stomach acid, messing the liver up. Like I could go on forever, right? And so this is where inflammation can lead to PCOS. Let's get inflammation is the symptom. I want to say that 100 times over to understand that. So it's not as simple as just taking like omegas or anti-inflammatories. Yes, it can help, but it's not answering the root cause. But that inflammation can lead to several things, like the insulin resistance, like your body holding on to androgens, especially if you have an overgrowth of bacteria, things like that, right? That's why you'll see like a lot of bloating and distension in women, with some women with PCOS, because of that. Now, for the big one here, this is the one that a lot of people do not understand. And this is where it goes very undiagnosed. And this is where I've made the mistake too, because I'm like, oh, we've done this, we've done saw palmetto, we've done this, we've done that, and it's not responding. Adrenal form of PCOS. You don't have to have cysts or high testosterone or high androgens to have the adrenal form of PCOS. This one is really important to understand. This is the one that a lot of women go undiagnosed, and doctors are just like, yeah, see you later. I don't know, sleep better, eat better, whatever, right? Some BS that they throw out there because they don't understand how to address this one or how to actually diagnose it. So when you look at the adrenal form, you have your HPA axis, your hypothalamus pituitary axis, and all this stuff is connected with the ovaries, the thyroid, gonad releasing hormone, blah, 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 blah. Okay. Super sciencey. What essentially happens is the overactivity of the adrenals will stimulate overproduction of DHEA, which feeds into your androgens, but it will also stimulate the overproduction of androgens. So now you have this double whammy here, and you have this increased levels of androgens leading to increased, because that's important to understand too. The high testosterone, like yes, the inflammation can create the high testosterone and androgens, but the high testosterone and androgens can also create the inflammation, especially if it's feeding into estrogen and blocking detox pathways. If you're not methylating properly, liver compromisation affects thyroid and so on and so forth, right? I try not to get too technical and take up too much time. Everybody knows me, knows I love to do that, but I'm trying my best not to do this. But the important thing to understand is this adrenal PCOS creating higher levels of DHEA and androgens and converting it to high levels of testosterone can happen independently without the ovaries. It can happen in peripheral tissues, right? And so this is where it goes really undiagnosed, because it's like, all right, well, your ovaries aren't doing this, you're not doing this, blah, blah, blah. It doesn't make sense, right? It could be the adrenal form. So essentially, how we're kind of like assessing the adrenal form is cortisol tests and stuff, right? It's you need quite a few factors to bring into account to like make sure, like, okay, this is the adrenal form. I actually am currently working with a client that for sure has the adrenal form, which is probably cascading into other things. But when you look at like her symptoms, like just has no energy, like can't get up in the morning, all this kind of stuff. But that's due to the chronic exposure of this situation. And so now it's just a matter of like refreshing cells and so on and so forth. I won't get into that, but that one really goes missed. And that's where I've yet to see anybody talk about that or properly understand that. It took myself quite a while too. Like I made a lot of mistakes getting up to this point to like understand the adrenal PCOS. But it's important, very important to properly diagnose. I'm going to say that again before I finish this podcast. Another thing too that's important to understand is certain birth controls can have androgens in them. So you'll actually be putting androgens in your body, which that can too lead to PCOS, which is also important to understand that, especially because this is a big thing here. Fitness-borne diseases, Polycystic Ovarian Syndrome is a real big one. And I'll go over 2 counts as to why this occurs. Because I'm on the topic of birth control and adding androgens to the body, let's talk PEDs, performance-enhancing drugs. So many women will do hours and hours of cardio a week, will cut so much food and lift 5-6 times a week, sometimes 7, not get the results they're looking for because they shouldn't be doing that. But they go, okay, well, obviously someone or themselves convinced that I need to do performance enhancing drugs in order to get these results, especially if they want to compete on the bodybuilding stage, because everybody else is already on them. So like, I'm sorry, but you're not going to have a very high chance of winning unless you have insane genetics, unless you go on performance enhancing drugs. No, I'm not promoting performance enhancing drugs. I'm going to make a whole podcast on that. Please understand that I do not promote those drugs. They're not as bad as people think when talking about problems, but that's why I'll make a podcast. Anyways, they'll go on something like Anavar because, it's mild, it's basic, whatever, but they might already have high androgens. They're already suffering from acne. They're already suffering from water retention. They're already suffering from irregular periods. They go on something like Anavar, which promotes higher androgens. Bam, they give themselves PCOS. I've seen it in the labs. I've seen it personally. So if you have these situations, please take care of that first before considering going on a performance enhancing drug. I cannot stress that enough. Anyways, the second count to that, where fitness-borne disease of PCOS, is the overtraining and undereating. You can look at a lot of young athletes as they grow up, young female athletes, obviously, as they grow up, they become PCOS, right? They get diagnosed with PCOS. And why is this? This goes back to when you look at the forms and the potential causes of polycystic ovarian syndrome. The overtraining and the undereating, or the overeating and the lack of recovery, and you name it, leads to the gut issues, to the mental issues, to the trauma, to the nutrient deficiencies, to the insulin resistance, to the inflammation, and it promotes all these factors that can create PCOS. It's very commonly caused by training. There's a lot of times I see women from like 18 to 24 years old just doing everything they can, whether it's like being in the gym, playing sports, doing this, so on and so forth. Then next thing you know, at the age of 28, 30, maybe even 40, all of a sudden they have PCOS. And that sounds weird for me to say because I'm only 32 years old, so how long? But you can just see it in the literature, right? And I have seen it personally from some people because it happens sooner to some than others based off genetics, right? And so those are ones to be very careful of. Make sure you're recovering. Make sure you're not overtraining. Make sure you're sleeping, right? Take care of your mental health. Manage your stress. Do all these things because it's super important that, you recover properly, that you don't create gut health issues, and that you don't create inflammation, and you don't get PCOS, right? Because a lot of women struggle with this. Obviously, I have no idea what it's like, right? But I've worked with quite a handful of women. I'm currently working with a handful of women with polycystic ovarian syndrome, and they struggle, right? And I don't want to see them go through that. Now, I'm not saying that they got it via that. Sometimes, like I said, stress and trauma is a huge factor of creating PCOS. So just be wary of all that kind of stuff. But it's also important not to confuse polycystic ovarian syndrome with amenorrhea. So like amenorrhea is the irregular or lack of cycle of a menstrual cycle in a female, because they'll get that. And sometimes doctors will be like, oh yeah, you might have PCOS, you might have that or whatever. And in reality, it's due to nutrient deficiencies, overtraining, and so on and so forth, right? Because what happens is, when you train, you need to use your hormones, so you burn through them. You're not eating enough. You're not resting enough. You're not producing enough DHEA, androgens, testosterone, estrogen, so on and so forth. And then that leads to missed or irregular cycles, plus possible symptoms of PCOS because of the inflammation and insulin resistance. Does not mean you have PCOS. So how do we distinguish this? We look at the luteinizing hormone and the follicular stimulating hormone on lab work, usually around day 2 of the cycle. And that will give us an indicator whether or not it's amenorrhea or polycystic ovarian syndrome. So I won't go into details of that, but that's something that you could check out to help understand, okay, am I having amenorrhea or am I potentially being diagnosed with polycystic ovarian syndrome? And also to be sure to rule out genetics, high levels of prolactin, and just hypersensitivity to androgens and whatnot. Don't just think, oh no, I have these symptoms. Oh no, the things he's saying, I might have PCOS. Don't make sure you diagnose properly. Make sure you seek out the help of a professional and diagnose this properly. That way you can create the best plan of action for moving forward. And so essentially that's, I'm trying to keep this, we're already at 22 minutes. I'm trying to keep this not too long, not too technical. I really want people to, engage and pay attention, just that way we can get a better understanding of polycystic ovarian syndrome. But I'll make a few comments here. So if we're looking at the forms of polycystic ovarian syndrome, so when we're talking about insulin resistance, how you can manage this. Now, please take this with a grain of salt because everybody's different, and without proper supervision, these recommendations might not work the greatest or at all. But when we're talking insulin resistance and the high testosterone androgens, the most common thing people do is like saw palmetto and stinging nettle, because that's going to help feed out. It's going to help aromatize that androgen, those androgens and testosterone, and kind of clear them out. Now, it's important to understand, though, it doesn't just clear out and go away. It goes to estrogen mainly. And then you could do that, but if you're not detoxifying estrogen properly, if you have high levels of beta-glucuronidase, if you have poor detox pathways, poor methylation, blah, 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 blah. Sorry for sounding so professional. Not sounding so professional, but that could just create more problems and more symptoms. So you want to make sure your liver is functioning optimally. Right? You want to make sure you have some form of liver support, whether that be not overtraining, sleeping properly, the nutrients to support this, like goji berries, supporting methylation, glutathione production. So like N-acetylcysteine is a good one. Inositol, you'll hear inositol really helps with PCOS too, because once again, it helps drain out androgens. It also helps with serotonin receptors, so improves happiness, so on and so forth. But you will see some women will take inositol and they'll start to feel a lot better. And then all of a sudden, after a couple months, they kind of feel this, they go back to feeling the same, or they feel worse because they're not properly detoxifying their estrogen. And it's kind of just recirculating in the system and leading to a lot of complications. So it's important to make sure that your liver is up to snuff. You could look at more advanced things like TUDCA, implementing some ox bile. Once again, consult a professional. Okay, please don't just blindly take these things. I have to stress that enough. I don't want that coming back on me. But so those are some forms you could deal with that. But obviously just a well-rounded diet and stress management. So when you look at probably the fastest way of safely decreasing inflammation would be the Mediterranean diet. Lots of olive oils, fruits and vegetables, fish, stuff like that. Stay away from chicken. Chicken might be on the Mediterranean diet. I don't know what Google says, but I always recommend staying away from chicken. A lot of people are intolerant to it, staying away from eggs, stuff like that. Lots of fish, grass-fed beef, things like that. So just a well-rounded diet to help decrease that inflammation. Now, I did see someone talking about polycystic ovarian syndrome and really, really promoting fiber, this is where you need to be careful. Yes, we understand that fiber is crucially important for all sorts of functions, but some people may not be ready for a big amount of fiber, whether that's due to just the lack of tolerance or in most cases, the overgrowth of bad bacteria, or even potential SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. All fiber is going to do is feed into that and create more inflammation, because the bacteria creates a lot of lipopolysaccharides, which create a lot of inflammation, which stress the hell out of the liver. And you can see where I'm going with this, right? So it's important to make sure that you're not feeding into that. So although you read, oh, fruits and vegetables, just make sure that when you're eating these fruits and vegetables that you're not getting worse. You're not, same with like probiotics. Don't blindly take probiotics, okay? Because I think they've been mentioned too that they really help or can help with PCOS. Just be careful when you're assessing these things. When you're talking about the pill, one of the, like to keep it very short and simple, when you prepare to come off birth control, just make sure you're eating a lot of food and supporting hormones. So you can look at things like chasteberry, humanofort, boron, make sure you're not overtraining, that you're sleeping lots, good amount of healthy dietary fats to produce cholesterol, to produce hormones, because you want to make sure you're at optimal levels so that when you pull it, it's not like this sudden massive change, which can create these effects. So that's like in a very simplistic nutshell to come off birth control and potentially negate the effects of post-pill PCOS. Eat a lot of food, sleep a lot, produce hormones, okay? Once again, the inflammation, that will go in with the insulin resistance and everything, just a sound diet, not overtraining, all that kind of stuff. And the adrenal one, that one's a little more tricky. Simplistically put, obviously decrease your stress load in your life, improve your, I don't want to say improve your adrenal function. Usually they function well. It's the resistance that's creating the problem, because I spoke about insulin resistance. Well, there's cortisol resistance is the same thing. So you can gunk up the membranes and not really accept cortisol. So you'll get misdiagnosed with like adrenal fatigue, when in reality, it's just your cell membranes are gunked up and you're having trouble accepting that cortisol. So cleaning up the cells, supporting liver function, decreasing inflammation, building your cell membranes out of healthy fats. So things like found in the Mediterranean diet. And that should really help. Lots of meditation, box breathing, nature walks, being by water, swimming, getting out to the mountains, having fun, being with good people, all that kind of stuff is a really good way to target. Don't really want to recommend supplementation other than, you could look at like ashwagandha and theanine and magnesium. You have to be careful though. There's some complexes like with cordyceps, they increase oxygenation and ATP production. You got like Rhodiola rosea extract to promote adrenal function. This kind of stuff. Just be careful once again, because it's all the professional. But at the end of the day, when it comes to the adrenal PCOS, as long as it's not like crazy genetics, like in a bad way contributing, just lots and lots of stress management, and which is like so much easier said than done in today's society, because we all know how stressful our society is. So, but that's like a good way that you can kind of like address the adrenal PCOS. And then just a quick tidbit with training, because I spoke about how training can cause PCOS symptoms or cause PCOS in itself, plus many, many other problems, gut issues, mental health issues, you name it. I understand that, yes, exercise serves so many benefits, but if you are not, it's not what you do in the gym, it's what you recover from. If you are not recovering properly, you can negate all those benefits and do the complete opposite. So when it comes to training, if you have PCOS, we'll talk in the case of having PCOS, I would say 4 times a week tops, maybe only 3. Okay. And you have to be, this is going to be a whole nother podcast about training stimuli and how they affect the physiology of the body, because not a lot of people talk about this or understand it. But in this case, don't do crazy high volume bodybuilding workouts. You're already inflamed. Don't contribute to the inflammation. You're not going to, sure, you have high androgens and high testosterone, but you're already super inflamed. You're not going to create enough signal via your training to promote a lot of muscle growth. So there's no point in doing these crazy workouts, right? I did see something too. sorry, just kind of getting sidetracked with this, where it's like, it's not all just about losing weight. That is correct, but the end result of losing weight is ultimately what can really help PCOS. But people with PCOS have trouble losing weight because of inflammation, insulin resistance, gut health, adrenal issues, thyroid issues, lack of hormones, you name it, right? So weight loss becomes really difficult and people get frustrated. So we start to say, oh, no, don't worry. It's not just about weight loss. Weight loss will really help. It's achieving that weight loss, so that can be very difficult, but you address all the things mentioned prior and you should have an easier time with achieving that weight loss, which will reduce inflammation, will reduce like high levels of testosterone and androgens, because there's less adipose tissue peripherals to convert these hormones into the ones we don't want too high of, so on and so forth. So weight loss, yes, is a very valuable tool. But anyways, back to the training. Just I say 3-4 times a week's top. You don't need to do cardio every day or tons of cardio. Just make sure you get nice casual walks in, lots of steps, lots of neat non-exercise activity, lots of movement. Speaking of insulin resistance, like after every meal, go for a 10-minute walk. I don't care if it's on your treadmill. Outside's obviously better, but treadmill's better than nothing. I'm guilty of just using the treadmill unless I'm walking my girls. But that will really help improve insulin sensitivity and decrease the risk of the resistance contributing to the PCOS. That's a really big one. Plus, you're getting in more steps per day, which is going to really help with all sorts of functions in the body. So yeah, 3 to 4 times a week. Don't need a ton of cardio. Don't need a massive deficit. You also don't maybe want like a calorie surplus. So kind of go around a maintenance level and just be freaking happy with what you're doing and what you're eating. Make wise choices. Stay away from alcohol. When you look at things like PCOS and how it affects hormones and neurotransmitters, it's going to promote addictive tendencies. And one of those being alcoholism. And you see it like a lot of women with PCOS drink a lot of alcohol, whether they go on the weekends or whichever. Not because alcohol will also increase confidence, because a lot of these women are struggling with lack of confidence. So the alcohol makes them feel better, antidepressant, whatever, right? It's only contributing. You feel better in that moment. And sure, you had a great time and everything, but then the next day or the next week or 6 months after that, you feel worse and you can't really resolve these issues. So I understand that in today's society, it's all about drinking and partying. You can't go have a food with a friend without getting a drink. I understand that, but just be wise about that. Try to limit your alcohol intake. There's nothing. The only little positive thing maybe about alcohol is the stress reduction, as long as you're doing it properly and you're not in a state where it's very, very damaging to you, like polycystic ovarian syndrome. But otherwise, there's no benefit to alcohol. It's poison. It's absolute poison. Anyways, that's what you kind of want to avoid. Obviously, we all know, no matter what symptom you have, to avoid, highly processed foods and so on and so forth. Doesn't mean you can't enjoy yourself. Just try not to make the abundance of your diet with heavily processed foods or things containing like a lot of like poor ingredients or whichever. But when it comes to the training, once again, I'm going to make this a separate podcast, because I could give out training tips. So, like very nutrient partitioning style training, which I'll actually kind of comment a little bit on the video of how I kind of achieved the results for my photo shoot. But you have to be trainable in a specific stimulus. So I could be like, okay, well, you're going to do a specific workout like this, but if you're already having very poor carb tolerance, it's probably not going to benefit you. So I'd rather make those other podcasts first to make more sense of things, and then everybody kind of have a general idea and they can maybe put together a better workout program for themselves. I will say though, carbs are your friend when utilized properly, but there is nothing wrong with doing a cyclical approach of low carb or like keto or whichever. Okay. You'll see that I see a lot of the information of PCOS going around demonizing low carb diets. Yes, long term, they can lead to a lot of health complications, whether we realize it or not. We get such a drastic response initially that we become biased to them. We're like, oh my goodness, this is amazing. I love how much weight I've lost and everything in 2 weeks. That's just water, glycogen, inflammation. Actual fat loss is very minimal. You go back to eating carbs, it all reverses. Okay. Not always, but usually that's the case. But a cyclical approach, like 2 or 3 times a week or 2 days a week or 1 week on of keto and then 2 weeks of carbs, something like cyclical approaches can really, really help reduce that inflammation, bring down hormones, stuff like that. I don't want to get too in depth because, as mentioned, everybody's different, and I don't want people taking this information and using it incorrectly until I start to, we're already going on 35 minutes here. So I don't want to make the podcast too long. I'll separate them into different podcasts, and I can talk more about like training and stuff. And, especially when it comes to disease states like polycystic ovarian syndrome. And one last thing too, polycystic ovarian syndrome can be an autoimmune disease. And a lot of people don't understand that either, right? And so when it comes to autoimmune diseases, it's important to assess which immune pathway you are dominant in, and address that appropriately. Because, I have an autoimmune disease. This says it's really good for immune health. It could be really bad for you, okay? So make sure you properly assess that as well. Seek out professionalism. You know the drill, okay? So hopefully that wasn't too much for everybody. If it was, as mentioned, please throw them in the comments, because I want to really provide some great information and not have people scratching their heads wondering, okay, well, he said this, but do I do this and do I do that? So if we could, if you guys could definitely throw in some comments or message me or whatever, and I can start elaborating either in the comments or podcasts to come, or I don't mind, sharing some messages back and forth kind of thing to help people within reason, mainly based off of the morals, because there's only so much I can recommend to a person without really knowing anything about their metabolism, history, and so on and so forth. So I hope you guys enjoyed that. And I think on the next podcast, or I think I'm going to stop saying what I'm going to talk about on the next podcast, because I might be changing it as time comes, because things pop up and I think, okay, maybe this is an important topic to talk about this week. So I guess you guys will just have to stay tuned for the next podcast. But thanks for those who are listening in and watching in. I hope you have a great night.